Oh, wait.
Good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
Alrighty, so as usual, I'll give it a minute or so for folks to sign on. And then today, what we're going to do is dive back into the lecture we started on Monday. Depending on how far we get with that, we have an activity that we'll either do today or on Friday, looking at logical fallacies and biases, some fun stuff there. Yeah, and we'll just keep going from there. But I'm gonna take a sec to check y'all in here and we'll go from there. Okie dokie. All right, so before I get into things, I feel like I've been transparent with y'all, so I'm gonna keep being transparent with y'all. I have now tested positive for COVID. So I have no idea what that means in terms of when I'm gonna be allowed to come back. I found out last night when my result came in over the MyChart. I have yet to actually talk to my doctor about it. My symptoms started last Monday. I know, like, I'm actually better now is the irony. Like, I'm not blowing my nose as frequently. So that thing I thought was just a random cold or allergies, that was COVID. I think my vaccine had trained my body to fight the good fights, but continuous exposure from two people at once, right? It just couldn't hold out as much as it wanted to. I am really hoping I'll get sort of like time served. But, you know, again, I have yet to talk to my doctor and see what she's going to recommend. And then I'll have to talk to HR and see what they're going to recommend. I obviously don't want to endanger any of you, so I don't want to come back to campus while I'm actively contagious, even though I'll, you know, probably wear a KN95 and whatnot. So, yeah. It's a lot of news, y'all. And I'm getting stir crazy. Like, I want to be back in the classroom with y'all. So, but I'm going to do whatever it takes to keep y'all safe. So, we will just keep going and figuring this out as we go. Yeah, I was like, oh, I won't tell them until I know for sure, like, whatever you guys need to know. So that being said, you know, again, especially since I'm feeling all right, we are going to just keep trucking along. You know, I am both proud and maybe a little like aghast at myself that I have never taken any time off during this. It's not necessarily a good model for y'all when you're sick, but I really haven't never felt that bad, right? So like it feels like a cold. So thank you, Moderna, right? Because I do have underlying conditions. So if I hadn't had the vaccine, I might be one of those people on a ventilator. So I am very grateful for the vaccine. And yeah, we'll just keep doing what we're doing.
And my test from Saturday came back negative, but I've been having worsening symptoms. So I'm definitely doing a 14-day quarantine because I started last night having a fever and coughing. So
Yeah, you can get the at-home tests now too. So I actually did one of those Sunday night, and it had come back positive, but I was like, I don't know how accurate those are, so I wanted to get it confirmed. They are funny. As someone who's had a child, it is identical to a pregnancy test. Like I had 2 pink lines, so it's a COVID. So you know what? You gotta laugh so you don't cry, right? Gosh. I'm just like even more annoyed with that parent from my daughter's school each time. Yeah, but again, we can keep learning. Thank you, Imani. Yeah, I mean, like my daughter and my husband are back at work and school. They're fine. It'll just be a matter of, what Wesleyan and my doctor agree on in terms of when I'm allowed to be back with y'all. And again, obviously don't want to expose you all. Like the last thing I want to do. So, alrighty. So we are talking about, and again, yeah, I love your chapter title here, right? It's like things we know that ain't so, right? But these are common misconceptions, and the idea is, how do we start to undermine some of these ideas we know aren't accurate? So this next one, if you haven't ever heard about it, may blow your mind. I'm gonna let the whole video play and then we'll talk about it afterwards.
This video is about learning styles. What kind of learner are you? I think visual learning. Is like auditory and interacting with it. I like to learn by doing myself. Hands-on, like if I have a model, I'd like to look at that and look at it. Part of this video is sponsored by Google Search. Information is presented in accordance with the learning style, well, then they'll learn better. There are dozens of different learning style theories, but the most common one identifies 4 main learning styles: visual, auditory, reading learning, and kinesthetic, or VORK for short. Visual learners learn best from images, demonstrations, and pictures. People may say things, but I can't really take it in. I just gotta see them act it out or write it or something. Auditory learners learn best from listening to an explanation. Like in school, I was always engaged in a lecture, and that wasn't good enough to pass a test. Reading writing learners learn best from reading and writing. Like I can get pretty much anything out of reading a test.
Okay, thanks for the info about the sound. I will try again. Maybe if I keep the video smaller, it will work. But if not, let me know and I can just mute it since we do have the captions. Thank you for giving me that info.
sounds kind of like it's coming through your speakers and not through Zoom. Like we're hearing it like secondhand.
I didn't share my sound. Okay, thank you. That's actually super helpful, y'all. Doop de doop. Yep, that's what happened. Thank you. Look at the power of us together. Okay, I'm gonna restart it since y'all couldn't hear.
This video is about learning styles. What kind of learner are you?
Oh yeah, I'm a visual person, so like I can see things, yeah.
I think visual learning.
Visual.
I mean, like I remember formulas like auditory.
Like I need to be like interacting with the material.
I like to learn by doing myself.
Very hands-on.
Hands-on learner.
Hands-on.
So like if I have a model, I'd like to look at that and look it over.
Part of this video was sponsored by Google Search. There is this idea in education that everyone has their own preferred way of learning, their so-called learning style. If information is presented in accordance with the learning style, well, then they'll learn better. Now, there are dozens of different learning style theories, but the most common one identifies 4 main learning styles: visual, auditory, reading, writing, and kinesthetic, or VARK for short. Visual learners learn best from images, demonstrations, and pictures.
People may say things, but I can't really like take it in. I just gotta see them act it out or write it or something.
Auditory learners learn best from listening to an explanation.
Like in school, I was always engaged in a lecture, and that was usually good enough to pass a test.
Reading, writing learners learn best from reading and writing.
Like I can get pretty much anything out of reading a textbook or something.
And kinesthetic learners learn best by doing, physically interacting with the world.
Hands-on, you have to touch things, you have to play with things. You know, it's a contact sport. You have to do it yourself.
I want to try something with you, a little experiment. I want to show you 10 pictures of things, and I don't want you to say anything while you're looking at them. And at the end of the 10, you tell me how many you can remember.
Okay.
Okay?
Okay. Okay.
Now, learning styles make intuitive sense because we know everyone is different. Some people have better spatial reasoning, others have better listening comprehension. We know some people are better readers, while others are good with their hands.
It sort of very much fits with a broad strain of thought in sort of the recent Western tradition is like, we're all unique, we're all different. And so you don't want to say like everybody learns the same way. That sort of conflicts with our feelings about what it means to be human.
So doesn't it make sense that people should learn better in their own preferred learning style? Well, teachers certainly seem to think so. A survey of nearly 400 teachers from the UK and the Netherlands found that over 90% believed that individuals learn better when they receive information in their preferred learning style.
Just like every professor has a different style of teaching, you have a different style of learning.
But when his teacher starts using visuals, Jonathan finds it easier to focus and understand the material, so he might be a visual learner.
Can you tell me what that means to you? Like, what does it mean to be a visual learner?
To me, it means that for me to learn something, sometimes I need to draw it, or I need to write it down, or I need to see a picture or a movie.
For example, science classes, I get bored easily just listening, and I think it's more interesting for me to actually be able to do it.
How do you know that you're a visual learner?
I don't. I just assume.
To take advantage of learning styles, then teachers need to do two things. First, identify the learning style of each of their students. And second, teach each student in accordance with their learning style. On the VARC website, it says, once you know about VARC, its power to explain things will be a revelation. But before you take an online learning styles quiz, it's a good idea to ask, do learning styles even exist? I mean, do you have one? And if you're taught in accordance with it, would you learn better? Well, you could test this by running a randomized control trial, where first you would identify learners with at least 2 different learning styles, say visual and auditory, and then randomly assign the learners to one of 2 educational presentations, one visual, one auditory. So for half of the students, the experience will match their learning style, and for the other half, it won't. And then you give everyone the same test. If the learning style hypothesis is correct, the results should show better performance when the presentation matches the learning style than when they're mismatched. I tried a very unscientific version of this experiment on the street. For some people, I matched their learning style, so I showed visual learners pictures of 10 items. But for other visual learners, I read out the items instead. Bell, penguin, sun.
Okay, I'm maxed out.
How many can you remember?
I don't know.
Pear, knife, duck, heart, butterfly.
Apple, bicycle, guitar.
There's a spider. Did I say I already?
Trumpet, pear, butterfly,
Knife,
boat,
heart,
heart.
I couldn't tell you the rest. That's all I got.
Most people could remember only about 5 or 6 things.
Yeah.
6?
Yeah.
6 is not bad.
All right.
6.
6 out of 10, which is not bad, right?
Oh, all right,
That's
yeah.
a passing score. Candle. Everyone forgets the candle. But a few could remember substantially more, say 8 or 9 items.
Bug, I don't know if I said bug. Guitar, bike, eye, bell, spoon, sun, chair. I'm forgetting the last 2.
That's pretty good.
8 is really good.
Oh, cool.
9?
9 out of 10.
9. Very impressive. But the reason didn't seem to be because the presentation matched their preferred learning style, but because they employed a memory strategy.
So like as you were showing, I was like making an order in my head. So as I saw more, I would just add it to the list, and I was repeating the list as I was looking at them, so I could just say it out loud.
Did you try a strategy while you were looking at those pictures?
Yeah. So I guess I tried like creating a story because it's easier to remember a story than just individual objects. So I try to like tie it all into one story.
This is obviously anecdotal evidence, but rigorous studies like the one I outlined have been conducted. For example, one looked at visualizers versus verbalizers instead of visual versus auditory learners. The study was computer-based. So first, students' learning styles were assessed using questions like, would you rather read a paragraph or see a diagram describing an atom? The researchers also provided some challenging explanations with two buttons, visual help or verbal help. The visual one played a short animation, whereas the verbal help gave a written explanation. From these measures combined, the researchers categorized the students as either visualizers or verbalizers, and then the students were randomly assigned to go through a text-based or picture-based lesson on electronics. When a student hovered their mouse over keywords in the lesson, in the text-based group, a definition and clarification came up. But in the picture group, an annotated diagram was shown instead. And after the lesson, the students did a test to assess their learning. The students whose preferred learning style matched their instruction performed no better on the tests than those whose instruction was mismatched. The researchers ran the test again with 61 non-college educated adults and found exactly the same result.
But learning styles are a preference. So how strongly do learners stick to their preference? Well, in a 2018 study, during the first week of semester, over 400 students at a university in Indiana completed the VARK questionnaire, and they were classified according to their learning style. Then at the end of the semester, the same students completed a study strategy questionnaire. So how did they actually study during the term? Well, an overwhelming majority of students used study strategies which were supposedly incompatible with their learning style, and the minority of students who did not perform significantly differently on the assessments in the course.
The visual, auditory, reading, writing, kinesthetic, or VARK model came about from Neil Fleming, a school inspector in New Zealand. Describing the origins of VARK, he says, "I was puzzled when I observed excellent teachers who did not reach some learners and poor teachers who did. I decided to try to solve this puzzle. There are, of course, many reasons for what I observed, but one topic that seemed to hold some magic, some explanatory power, was preferred modes of learning, modal preferences. And thus, VARK was born. There was no study that revealed students naturally cluster into 4 distinct groups, just some magic that might explain why some teachers can reach students while others can't. But how can this be? If we accept that some people are more skilled at interpreting and remembering certain kinds of stimuli than others, like visual or auditory, then why don't we see differences in learning or recall with different presentations? Well, it's because what we actually want people to recall is not the precise nature of the images or the pitch or quality of the sound, it's the meaning behind the presentations. There are some tasks that obviously require the use of a particular modality. Learning about music, for example, should have an auditory component. Similarly, learning about geography will involve looking at maps. And some people will have greater aptitude to learn one task over another. Someone with perfect pitch, for example, will be better able to recall certain tones in music. Someone with excellent visuospatial reasoning will be better at learning the locations of countries on a map. But the claim of learning style theories is that these preferences will be consistent across learning domains. The person with perfect pitch should learn everything better auditorily. But that is clearly not the case. Most people will learn geography better with a map. Review articles of learning styles consistently conclude there is no credible evidence that learning styles exist. In a 2009 review, the researchers note the contrast between the enormous popularity of the learning styles approach within education and the lack of credible evidence for its utility is, in our opinion, striking and disturbing. If classification of students' learning styles has practical utility, it remains to be demonstrated.
What we're expecting is, if your style was honored, you're going to perform better than if you had some experience that conflicted with your style. And this is where we don't see any support for the learning styles theory.
One of the reasons many people find learning styles so convincing is because they already believe it to be true. For example, they may already think that they're a visual learner, and then when a teacher shows them a diagram of, say, a bike pump, and suddenly the concept clicks, well, they interpret this as evidence for their visual learning style.
You already believe that learning styles is right. When you have an experience, the first thing you think is that in some way consistent with learning styles? And if it is, you don't think further.
When in reality, that diagram might just be a great diagram that would have helped anyone learn. When we already believe the world to be a certain way, then we interpret new experiences to fit with those beliefs, whether they actually do or not. So if learning styles don't improve learning, then what does? Well, there's a large body of literature that supports the claim that everyone learns better with multimodal approaches, where words and pictures are presented together rather than either words or pictures alone.
Now there's going to be words as well as the picture. We're going to see if this is any better.
So you get the gist of it. I just wanted to get to the part where he talked about people really still holding on to those beliefs, right? So what are people's reactions to this? The idea of learning styles is still very much ingrained in not only, like the lay consciousness, the public consciousness, but honestly, in like our own education department, for example. So what are people's reactions to this information?
It's definitely something I didn't expect. Like I've always thought like, oh, I learn best this way. And I guess I've reinforced it myself because I use those ways and they work. But I never thought that it might not be a real thing.
Yeah. I mean, I don't think anyone would just guess like, oh, that's bunk. Yeah, Imani, the fact that the test scores weren't different, right? I mean, like if you take a step back, there we go, and you actually do research on these things, right? That shows you whether it works or not. Oliver says some of my teachers would talk about their requirements and they said they had to include different learning styles. Yeah, I mean, again, I think like probably to this day, our education department is doing this. And I think part of what happens here is a microcosm of the issue we've been talking about in general with access to information. So a large number of the studies sort of discrediting learning styles have actually been done in the psychological literature, perhaps by cognitive psychologists like Dr. Ariel. He hasn't done these, but that's his subfield. Whereas a lot of the stuff on learning styles is done within the field of education. And you would think, well, these are both academic fields. It's got to overlap. Not necessarily, right? So like when I was showing you all how to search for stuff, we go to PsycInfo, right? And so we're looking at psych journals, right? And I'm sure education has their own thing they use too. So even in this field of accessible science, right? When we are in places where we do have access to this information, we don't always have that overlap. So Emily says that she learned about this in a prior psych class. It's really interesting. I like that. We can just use it as an excuse, basically, right? The idea that, well, I did poorly because that teacher didn't teach to my learning style, right? Yeah, it's nice to have a fallback, right? It's nice to not say I didn't study, right? And like admit to yourself, or I could have paid more attention in class or something like that, right? Yeah, we've all had those moments. And this is one of the reasons why, and you'll see this probably with most of your psych classes, we try to really mix things up, right? So yeah, we'll lecture, but then we'll also have group discussion and I'll show videos, right? We'll do activities where you all are actually engaging in these things. And it's because essentially A, repetition just is going to help you remember things, but B, repetition in sort of different modalities, as they just said, is what's going to help you all learn. Yeah, believe it or not, we think about that. I go to whole conferences about how to teach better. So, and then Oliver's saying, I think it's funny because I do have trouble learning certain ways. Yeah, and that can be a difference, right? Some of us just have actual physiological things going on that get in the way. And then that can be it. Yeah, and I think that Stacey, in general, I think probably just about anyone would say the exact same thing, right? It's not because you're an auditory learner. When I go to a conference and they just have a PowerPoint slide with a wall of text, right? And they're just talking on and on and on and on, I also zone out, right? Even if it might be information I'd normally be pretty interested in, right? So a lot of this is about honestly how to be a good presenter slash professor slash teacher, right? And again, these interactive, multimodal, getting at the same information in different ways. That's one of the reasons why Perusal is so awesome, right? Because it gets you to read in a different way, a more engaged way than you typically do. So yeah, it's so funny because Dr. Martorell is like, this is one of her big like she gets so mad whenever anyone brings up learning styles. And she and I were having I think either a text conversation. Yeah, a text conversation about it. And I was like, oh, I'm gonna bring up learning styles at 2:02. It's perfect. And she's like, yes. Alrighty. I'm gonna skip this. This is just a fun video since your chapter starts off by talking about mesmerism. If any of you have taken or plan to take history of psychology with Dr. Jackson, you'll learn more about mesmerism. This was essentially very akin to a lot of modern ideas about I can do magic with my hands and cure you by just like going like this, right? And there are some hilarious letters in one of the books that's used in History and Systems where like psychologists are writing to each other, to the people who are like engaging in mesmerism, and like, please stop, it makes us look bad. So, you know, you can see that as well. Alrighty, so your book talks a lot about culture, and this is something we sort of hinted at, but I don't think we've covered in a lot of detail, so I think this is really important. So again, if you've taken something like social psych, right, this will sound familiar to you, certainly if you've taken like a sociology class, but I think it's important to revisit. And so this is the definition from your book: the shared way of life for a group of people. Including such common characteristics as behaviors, values, and beliefs that are passed on from one generation to the next. And I actually found this video that I love because it's made for kids. And you might feel like, Dr. Myers, why are you showing us something made for kids? Well, oftentimes they explain it the most clear, right? So little quick video explaining about culture here.
What does it mean when people talk about cultures and traditions? What is a culture? A culture is a pattern of behavior of a group of people. These can include what kind of food they eat, the language they speak, the sports they enjoy and play, their music, their beliefs, and many other things. Every culture has their own traditions. But what is a tradition anyway? Traditions are the beliefs, routines, and ways of celebrating in families or cultures. Traditions can include what kinds of meals you eat when you celebrate holidays. They can include what kinds of gifts are given. A tradition can be a special prayer you say before bedtime. It can be how you celebrate Thanksgiving or Halloween, or a special treat your grandma likes to make for you. Many families have a special tradition for decorating their Christmas trees or for their first days of school. What traditions do you have in your family?
So again, cute little video, right? Really gets at the heart of what makes up a culture. And where culture becomes relevant for this class is all of that they just talked about, right? How we honor things, how we celebrate things, how we eat, how we speak, our beliefs religiously or otherwise, our music, what have you, is going to shape how we look at things, right? And it's going to shape what we believe when we're presented with information and how we react to that information. It was so interesting to me, sort of looking at this from a critical eye. As I was watching that video, I was thinking how many of those things in American culture in particular, although certainly it extends to other countries, are commodified, right? Are really just based on capitalism, right? If we think about like Halloween being like the second biggest holiday now compared to Christmas, it's like, so you could buy all these things. They're doing a trunk or treat at our church, and they're like, oh, you can just buy a kit online. I found one for not that pricey, but I was looking and there are car decorating kits that are $300 on Etsy, right? Like everything's sort of commodified. And so it's interesting to sort of think about that as a perspective we have in the US, right? And how is that going to affect how we interpret things?
What does it mean?
All right, so let's think about this. What are examples of culture you can think of for the US?
first thing that comes to my mind is like Thanksgiving. That's pretty much an American holiday.
Yeah, yeah. And other countries have Thanksgiving, but it's not quite as big as it is here, right? Yeah, the Super Bowl, huge, right? Football culture in general. The 4th of nothing more American than the 4th of July, right? Yeah, definitely. Yeah, Amani, I think you're really pointing that out. There are cultures within cultures within cultures in American culture, you know, Southern versus Northern, Black culture, white culture, family tradition is a huge piece of this. Yeah, Oliver, American foods, burgers? I don't know, right? And there are obviously regional foods in America, but a lot of those come from traditions from other places, right? So like if we take this down to the South, right? What do we think of when we think of the culture of the South in the US?
Sweet tea and barbecue.
Sweet tea and barbecue, yes. I discovered sweet tea after I moved to the South, never looked back. I don't understand why people drink unsweetened iced tea. Soul foods, yeah. Shrimp and biscuits, Cajun food, yeah, hungry. Yeah, Christian presence, certainly a big part of the American South as well. We talk about the Bible Belt, right? And a really interesting thing, a lot of what we're naming here is foods that come from the African American tradition, right? That may have been based on culturally African foods or the Cajun influence from folks who came like through the Caribbean and then here. So, and again, because our culture is our culture, some of these things have really been appropriated, right? Transportation. Ooh, Amani, say more about that.
I mean, like in Jersey, like for instance, like my grandmother, like she don't even have a license. So like because she uses public transportation, it's a big thing. Like everything is pretty much close to each other. So like when I go up there, like I really don't have to drive. I don't have to like, so I can fly up there and like walk to a corner store, you know, walk to a friend's house, and it's like not a big deal. It's not seen as like, oh, you broke, you don't have a car. But like down here, like in the South, it's like you have to drive everywhere. Like you can't just walk to a Walmart or walk to a gas station. Like you have to drive everywhere. So I feel like transportation is like a big thing, like culture wise of like, yeah, I feel like that's a big thing.
Yeah, Imani, I'm totally in agreement with that. As you were talking, I'm wondering how much of that is actually more like city versus rural slash suburban, right? So I grew up in Detroit, and Detroit was built around the auto industry. So for that reason, they purposely did not create good public transportation because they wanted everybody to buy cars. And so I kind of think of it that way, right? So that sometimes that comes into play. Yeah, I think, you know, whenever I visit a city, I'm always sort of amazed similarly, right? Like when I go to London or New York City, you know, again, I don't need to worry about driving. Public transportation is pretty darn easy to navigate, right? I've even like taken the subway in Paris and navigated it in a different language, right? The metro. So yeah, I think that's a big thing, right? And that really does influence your life. Weather is huge, yeah. I freak out about tornadoes a lot more than hurricanes because I'm from the Midwest and those happen more often there and are devastating. But at least in the Midwest, you have basements, right? And here I don't have a basement in my house. And so I always sort of freak out, like, oh my gosh, the house is just gonna fall on me and that'll be it. You know, but like, knock wood, I've been pretty safe, right? Yeah. So I think that weather can really make a big difference. Things like flooding here in particular. Now we're getting more into like the whatever we want to call this area, right? Hampton Road / Coast of Virginia / Tidewater / I guess marketing wise, they want to call us the 757 now, which like is fine, but I don't think is that necessarily appealing. What are some of the cultural things, the cultural traditions in our particular area here? I've also heard it called the 7 cities, right? So Suffolk, Norfolk, Chesapeake, Virginia Beach, Hampton, Newport News, and I am missing one. But there's another one. Military culture is huge here, right? So we have all 5 branches. We have the biggest naval base in the world. I'm not sure if people know that. The Norfolk Naval Base is the biggest naval base in the world. Yeah, and that also means that we kind of have people from all over here, right? Yes, electronics integrated into public schools even before the pandemic, right? And now even more so. Yeah, definitely. I would say, you know, and again, this is sort of my own biased perspective, right? But I would say one of the things that's really important to our culture here, in addition to the military, is academia. If you just think about how many colleges and universities we have, right? So us, Regent, Hampton University, Norfolk State, ODU, right? Christopher Newport, right? Like it's unusual to have that many colleges and universities clumped together like this. So yeah, beach culture is a huge thing as well, right? We have the East Coast Surfing Championship every year. Speaking of beach culture, Orange Crushes apparently started here. So we got our signature drink. Generational cultures, yeah, because like most people are from everywhere else, you kind of build that within here. We also have some really cool history a lot of people don't know about, right? So like in sort of what's now the Oceana area, there used to be like an entirely African-American community that was like self-sustaining and really came out of post-slavery and really sort of built up that culture. And that was really unusual in the South at that time, right? We are a Southern state that's always been sort of weirdly on the cusp of being a Southern state, partially because of geography and partially because of, you know, where we are in terms of the military and medical system and the different colleges and universities as well. All right, how about VWU? What are some things of the culture of VWU that stand out to y'all? I'll get started. I know one that just had strict. Yeah. Yeah, I've heard of some of how they cracked down on y'all. It could be interesting. I'll just put it that way. The one I think of that like just happened, right, is mud games. That's a big tradition here. Homecoming is traditionally a pretty cool tradition. In the past, the psych departments even walked in the homecoming parade and thrown brains to the crowd. You know, I think athletics right here are a big part of our culture. Now we are a winning culture in softball, woohoo! Right, but in the past we've been, you know, we've had national championship teams in basketball. We had a national champion in golf, for example. Other things that I think about that may be sort of positive or negative is, you know, the yeah, I got a private message from someone saying like crappily dealing with Title IX issues. Historically, yes, I think we're better now. But yeah, only half joking because yeah, we've had some bad history of that. Really bad. Just Google like VWU Title IX, you'll find stuff about it, unfortunately. I don't know if students run into this, but professors often hear that's not the Wesleyan way. We want to change something. I think common to small places like this, regardless of if they're towns or colleges, right? People just think the way we've always done things is great. They also think we're special. No money in the budget for that. Yeah, tell me about it. Sorry, I got distracted thinking about the budget and I forget what I was going to talk about, but that's okay. But yeah, oh, here we go. Great story. So there is a lot of research that also may surprise you all that shows that student evaluations of professors are biased against people of color, people of minoritized sexual and gender identities, and women And so a couple of years ago, a lot of the female faculty really tried to raise heck about this, and not because any of us have in particular bad evaluations. In fact, mine tend to be pretty good, but because we recognize that we find this over and over and over. And there's meta-analyses showing that this is problematic. My favorite is the randomized control study where they assign students randomly to the same class that was taught online asynchronous. You never saw the professor, exact same material, right? Nothing changed. They just told one class they had a female professor and one class they had a male professor, and the female professor was ranked lower. And I was told by someone, well, we're different. That doesn't happen here. And I wanted to be like, I couldn't think of it in the moment, but I wanted to be like, you know, we have the Greer Center. So does that mean that like climate change doesn't happen here? Right? Like, it's not true. Yeah, not updating the dorms or things like that. Right. Yeah. Priorities, perhaps not the things we would always think of. And I think we're getting into like more of the negatives, which I fully acknowledge. I started us down that path, but I also think of some positive things when I think of Wesleyan. You know, we tend to throw around the word community, and it is a little cheesy, but it is spot on. I think of how many of you have reached out to me since I've had to be quarantining. I think about how many of my colleagues have offered to do things for me or checked in on me. You know, that's a big part of why I came here. You know, when you interview as a professor for a job, you have to give like a guest or a mock lecture. And most places I interviewed, maybe one or two students would ask questions afterwards, and you could tell their professor was kind of elbowing them to do it. And like 10 students asked me really good questions here. And I was like, that's the type of place I want to be at. So there are some good things as well, obviously, recognizing that we have a lot of what on my internship year we phrased growth edges, right? That we can better. Professors know you by name. Yeah, that's not a normal college experience. That's a really good point. You know, as engaged as I am with all y'all, you know, when I taught, when I was in grad school and my upper level class, the like small class was 90 plus people, I only knew a few of their names, right? Whereas I really tried to get to know all of you, and it helps that I have most of you in multiple classes, or I have had you in the past, or will have you in the future, right? So yeah, I really like that connection too. There's a reason I'm here and I stay here, because it's really y'all and then my colleagues. So the culture then translates to the cultural milieu, which is where and when we are born plays a significant role in our worldview. Existential psychologists call this thrownness. I kind of love that title for it. It's like the time and place you are thrown into, right? When you are born really shapes how you look at things, right? So we are, you know, in, again, this capitalistic Western culture that's fraught with racism and all kinds of other things. And that is going to really play a role in our worldview. I think we're also in a place that, you know, in general, no matter how loud the dissenters are, in general, our culture is really making a lot of scientific advances and benefiting from that, right? And starting to recognize the value of education in general, right? And recognizing that not all educations need to look the same, which I think is really good. And all those things will influence our worldview. And so your book kind of brings up a couple of good points here. I wanted to make sure to have the definitions for y'all. So analytic thought are cognitive processes that involve logical, categorical, and rule-based thought, in which elements of a situation or object are considered independent of their context. So analytic thought can be good to have, but as you can see, this independent of their context becomes a problem, right? So you get a lot of people in the US saying things like, well, everyone has the same opportunities. So like, I don't understand why people don't just pull themselves up by their bootstraps and do what I did and get a small loan of $1 million from their father, right? we have to look at context. We have to look at the, the 1619 Project and the horrible history of racism and eugenics in the US, right? And recognize that we do have scars that we created to heal until we actually get to equity, for example. Holistic thought are cognitive processes that involve the use of context and relationship among objects in the dynamics of a situation. So in psychology in particular, we really try to think holistically, right? That social, clinical aspect of psychology is what is the context in which this is happening. We've mentioned the fundamental attribution error previously. So this is the tendency, and interestingly, we see this more in Western cultures, to account for other people's behavior using dispositional or personal attributions. The silly example I give of this is, if I see someone else trip, I'm like, they're so clumsy. But if I trip, I'm like, who put that sidewalk there, right? But obviously this can be really scary, right? One of the readings I'm going to do in a couple of weeks with my women's and gender studies class is called something along the lines of Stop Blaming Black People for Dying of COVID-19, right? So there's this idea that when people of different races or ethnicities suffer different medical problems, it is because is their fault in some way. When you don't look at the context of some of those folks living in food deserts where they don't have access to a range of dietary choices that are affordable, right? Again, to think about what we know from psychology about the amount of stress, racism, and other types of prejudice put on the body, right? And that being related to these things. So the idea that we tend to be like, oh, well, this other race, it's because they just are lazy, right? And again, not saying that anyone in this room does that, but that's traditionally how we have looked at things, again, inaccurately. We need to go to that holistic approach and think about the culture and think about the nuances. And like we did with VWU, think about both the good and the bad, right? Okay, so one of the things that your book sort of talks about is Piaget's theory of cognitive development. And so it is just like, all kiddos go through this, and this is eventually what you'll get through in terms of the different stages, right? I'm not going to go over it in detail just because we are not a developmental class, right? But essentially it's like at each of these big age groups, you should start to be able to do these things. But there are criticisms. And so one of the things you can see here, and unfortunately the photo turned out kind of blurry, but one of the things they mention is cultural differences, right? There are cultural differences among this that when you just take a theory and say, this applies to everybody, you're missing stuff, right? Another example that you, again, may have learned if you looked at or taken any kind of developmental class, or even I think 102 we covered this, or 101, is Kohlberg's theory of moral development. The idea is as you age, you get more sophisticated in the nuances of addressing whether or not to like break rules to protect people, for example. And again, we don't need to go into the details, but that's the gist. And Kohlberg was like, this is uniform across everything. One of the biggest criticisms of Kohlberg came from psychologist Carol Gilligan, a Harvard psychologist, who was like, your system repeatedly and consistently downgrades the way girls are answering these things, and is sort of leaving out the relational aspect of things. So Kohlberg's system is kind of thinking about things more abstractly, and Gilligan is like, a lot of people, honestly, not just girls, make decisions based on how it will affect others in their lives, right? And so I'll also leave there. We'll start with self-deception on Friday. But essentially, if we only look at something from one perspective, right, we might be missing some of this. And again, if we take a theory and we just copy paste it and assume it will apply for all people. And again, I'm teaching my assessment class after this. If we take a assessment instrument and we copy paste it and assume it will apply for all people, it's going to be problematic, right? And it is going to devalue people who don't think in this sort of mainstream way. Again, whether based on gender, culture, racial, ethnic identity, socioeconomic status, what have you. So it's really important, again, particularly as psychologists, that we look at the context of everything. Already awesome discussion today, y'all. I really appreciate you diving into it. And we'll keep talking about that stuff on Friday. And then on Friday, we'll probably do our activity as well. So have a good day. And I know I'll see some of you in just a minute and some of you tomorrow. And if not, I'll see you Friday.